Welcome to the One Big Beautiful Bill making the TCJA permanent and reshaping US tax policy. I'm Philip Behrendt, chair of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's tax section, and I will be serving as a moderator for today's session. My role is actually only to facilitate your participation by monitoring the chat, relaying your question to Mark, and at the appropriate time during this presentation, please do not hesitate to submit your questions in the chat as we go along. We encourage your engagement and look forward to a dynamic discussion. The text section is sponsored by Hochman, Salk and Tosha Perez. Hochman, Salk and Tosha Perez BC advantage is experience, an eye for innovation, and genuine dedication to clients, their families, and their business, in addition to their national practice in civil tax and criminal tax controversies and related litigation in federal state court. We also have a white-collar practice. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Mark Gerson, member of Miller Chevalier. Mark's practice focuses on federal tax policy, providing strategic advice and representation to clients before Congress, the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the Internal Revenue Service. Prior to rejoining Miller Chevalier, Mark served as Majority Tax Counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means. In that role, he provided policy and technical analysis with respect to the development and evaluation of tax legislation. He acted as the staff liaison to Committee on Ways and Means members, the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance, the Joint Committee on Taxation and Treasury. He serves on all major tax legislation enacted in the 109th Congress, including the Gulf Opportunity Zone Act of 2005, the Tax Increase Prevention and Reconciliation Act, and others. So he's a perfect candidate to let us know what's new in that bill. And now let's get started. Mark, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to the Bar Association for the invitation. The timing of this presentation couldn't be more perfect. We had the Congress consider the bill. We've been working on it for most of the year. But we had activity in May and June, and the president signed it on July 4th, a week ago today. So really perfect timing to dig into kind of how the bill came to be, what's in it, and then talk a little bit about potential next steps. So turning to the next slide, just to talk a little bit about our agenda today. First, a little review of the results of the 2024 election that set the stage for this year. Talk about Congress's overall legislative agenda for the year. Talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill in depth, and then finish up with a couple of topics. One, potential for other tax legislation this year post-reconciliation. Talk about what else Congress is going to work on for the remainder of the year. Set out some important dates, and then end with a brief kind of preview of the 2026 midterm congressional elections, which are right around the corner. So turning to the next slide, just quickly to go over the results of the 2024 election. We had this Republican sweep. President Trump had this decisive win, some will call a mandate. In the last couple of elections, there have been 7 so-called battleground states that determined the election. He won all 7 convincingly. So a real convincing victory for President Trump for his second term. With him, he really carried the House. Republicans were able to maintain control of the House, and I would say maybe 6 to 8 months before the election, the thought was that Democrats were going to take back control of the House. That being said, it's a very small majority, 220 to 215. It's the smallest majority since 1931, and a lot of legislation this year is really driven by what can pass the House. Right now, the Democrats are actually down a couple of seats. There have been 3 Democratic members who unfortunately have passed away. We'll talk about when those seats will be filled this year. In the Senate, Republicans took control of the Senate after 4 years in the minority. They picked up 4 seats, so they have a 53 to 47 advantage. Next slide. Briefly, just talking about what the agenda is for the year. Need to increase the debt, and a lot of these items were taken care of in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Address the debt limit. The government has already been funded for fiscal year 2025 through September 30th. So the Congress is going to have to turn again to funding the government for fiscal year 2026 or face government shutdown. And then a kind of a laundry list of kind of the number of items that Trump and Republicans ran on: cuts in government spending, border security, which is another kind of euphemism for building the wall, immigration enforcement, which has certainly been in the news, defense legislation, and domestic energy production. In addition, turning to the next slide, other legislative agenda items: extension of the farm bill programs. Obviously, there's a lot of time being spent in the Senate confirming Trump's cabinet and other senior level administration employees. Natural disaster relief, which is something that has been under consideration since the California fires. There also was recently the Texas floods, North Carolina, so we may see a disaster package. Congress may have to, kind of legislate around what the administration is doing on cost cutting and tariffs. And then finally, and most important to folks on the call, tax and extending the expiring TCJA tax relief provisions. Turning to the next slide. So far, what we've seen between Trump and the Republican Congress is that the president is really able to get Congress to do what he wants when he wants it done. Again, there is this narrow majority in the House that is challenging. It definitely gives kind of the fiscal hawks, the Freedom Caucus, the most conservative House Republicans, unique power in influencing legislation. There is a pretty small majority in the Senate, but that has been much more manageable. They've been able to kind of process Trump's agenda without too much friction. And I think we've seen a number of real successes for the president in the first months of his second term. His cabinet nominees, some of whom were very controversial, were confirmed basically without incident. He was able to fund the government for fiscal year 2025. We've seen Congress and the courts largely defer to the administration on administrative action, whether it's kind of these DOGE cost-cutting exercises, tariff policy, overall foreign policy. And then we've really seen a shift of kind of the governing of the country is much more by these hundreds of executive orders versus a relatively few pieces of legislation that we've seen enacted, although the bill enacted on July 4th is quite substantial. Turning to the next slide. The big advantage of this Republican sweep, where Republicans control the White House, Senate, and the House of Representatives, is that they can use so-called reconciliation, which is a special kind of procedure that the Congress can use, where instead of meeting the 60-vote threshold in the Senate to defeat a filibuster, you only need a majority. So Republicans, with those 53, they can pass partisan legislation without any Democratic support, assuming, kind of in their inter-party negotiations, they basically need to get all Republicans on the same page. And so for this one big beautiful bill, Republicans could only lose 3 votes in the House or 3 votes in the Senate. So they really had to have a consensus package, and that took a number of months to develop. Turning to the next slide. And so as we saw the kind of progress of the bill this year, the first couple months, it was relatively slow. There was a lot of debate about the underlying budget resolution, which is kind of a framework that the House and Senate have to pass that sets forth the parameters for the reconciliation bill. And so a lot of discussion, the size of tax cuts, how much tax relief, were there going to be tax increases, the level of spending cuts, the level of the debt limit increase, and then this big debate about how they were going to measure the impact of the bill between a so-called current law baseline and a current policy baseline. And what we saw kind of during these debates, and even when there was actual consideration of the actual bill, is that you did have these narrow majorities and these little factions in the House and Senate that were really kind of exerting their power. And so the so-called SALT coalition, which were House Republicans from high tax states like California who are concerned about the individual SALT deduction cap, fiscal hawks, so-called Medicaid moderates who are concerned about Medicaid cuts, um, Republicans who were very supportive of the green energy credits, in contrast to the fiscal hawks who wanted them all repealed, perhaps retroactively. And so you saw, particularly over the first couple of months of the year, but even when the actual bills were being debated, you saw these groups really trying to kind of get their way. They eventually, I would say, got some compromises, but then in President Trump's rush to get this bill to a signing ceremony on July 4th, they essentially caved on a lot of their issues. And so you really saw a bill that was driven by the White House and driven by congressional leadership. Turning to the next page. Um, and so from a timeline perspective, for such a large bill, kind of went through relatively quickly once they agreed on a budget resolution. Ways and Means had a markup. Then the bill passed by one vote on May 22nd. The House was focused on passing the bill by Memorial Day. The Senate then passed a kind of pretty dramatically different bill on July 1st. They didn't have a committee markup. Again, passed by one vote. Vice President Vance had to cast the tie-breaking vote. It is using kind of current law, it is a $4.5 trillion bill. It's a massive bill. The House then passed that Senate amended bill on July 3rd by 4 votes, kind of their largest margin. And then on July 4th, it was signed into law. So between May 22nd and July 4th, like a real sprint. So to kind of get into the meat of the bill, turning to the next slide. First, from a non-tax perspective, I mean, this is a major piece of really hits a lot of the Trump and congressional Republican agenda policy items, even before we get to extending TCJA. Kind of the cornerstone is, really significant spending cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, which is kind of the food stamp program. A lot of border security legislation, so a lot of funding for the wall, a lot on immigration enforcement, defense spending, domestic energy, kind of cutting back on IRA green energy credits and pushing forth fossil fuel production, and then increasing the debt limit by $5 trillion. So then turning the slide, getting into tax, kind of the cornerstones of the bill. First, obviously, kind of permanency with some enhancement of all the individual and estate tax relief that was originally enacted in 2017 and set to expire at the end of the year. So maintaining kind of current law with respect to the individual rate structure, including that top rate of 37%, permanency of the 20% Section 199 Cap A pass-through deduction for S corps and partnerships. That originally the House passed bill had an increase in from 20 to 23%. That did not get taken up in the Senate. The estate, it kind of increased estate and gift tax exemption, made permanent at $15 million per individual, $30 million per couple. Those amounts are indexed for inflation. Permanent increase in an enhanced child tax credit. Beyond TCJA, the other cornerstone were the Trump campaign tax relief proposals put in on a temporary basis. And so we're seeing kind of this formalization and legislation of no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, an increased standard deduction for seniors, deductibility of domestic car loan interest. Those are all subject to caps that I've laid out, and they're also subject to phase down based on income levels. Again, these are temporary provisions. They kind of certainly get through the Trump presidency. Not unusual, these are very expensive provisions, but even beyond their cost, not unusual for kind of new tax relief to be enacted on a temporary basis, to see how it functions, to see what refining it needs, to see how the guidance and process works, how the IRS is enforcing it. So very interesting, will be a real focus of IRS guidance as well going forward. Next slide. The other thing, kind of major kind of cornerstone of the bill, was permanency of the so-called Big Three. These were 3 kind of very kind of widely used business tax relief provisions, originally enacted in 2017. They all have actually expired. So that's 100% bonus depreciation, the domestic R&D expensing instead of amortizing, The more favorable interest expense deduction limitation. There are some tweaks to these provisions, but they all have been made permanent. Again, very expensive. Bonus depreciation was extended to essentially to factories on a temporary basis. A large package of international tax reform changes that there were no kind of international tax provisions in the House bill. It was all a product of the Senate. Turning to the next slide. A lot of other kind of miscellaneous tax relief provisions in the bill. So there's permanency of the Fisher Section 45S PFML credit for private employers. There's permanency enhancement of community development incentives. So for opportunity zones, the low-income housing credit, the new markets tax credit. Turning to the next slide. And there is some funding of that tax relief. So the cost isn't completely upset, but there are a number of significant revenue raisers or tax increases in the bill. We're going to talk about what's not in the bill and what people were worried about. But what we saw here was really not kind of, I would say, like generally applicable tax increases, but things that were much more targeted. One of the major revenue drivers, of course, is the individual SALT deduction cap. That was, originally 10,000 for individuals and couples under TCJA. That was increased, and probably the most debated, controversial provision in the bill. That eventually there was an agreement to increase that up to $40,000, but it's phased out beginning at $500,000, and it's only temporary. It's through 2029, and then it'll revert back to the kind of 2017 $10,000 number. With IRA green energy credits, which was a real focus of deficit hawks, a lot of those credits are being terminated, phased out, subject to new restrictions. There was a significant increase in the excise tax on university endowment funds, which got a lot of publicity. Now the top rate is up to 8%. Provisions that I think caught some folks by surprise were both applied to individuals and corporations. There is a taxable income floor on charitable contribution deductions. So, for example, for individuals, the first 0.5% of deductions equivalent to their taxable income, they don't get a deduction for. So it's a kind of a lost deduction. It's a 1% threshold on corporation. I think people are thinking a lot about what they're doing as far as ongoing charitable giving, what they're doing with employee matching programs. Some people are thinking about accelerating charitable contribution deductions before the end of the year. So that's kind of generated a lot of activity. Somewhat related is this new, kind of piece type limitation that the tax benefit of itemized deductions, including charitable contributions, is limited to 35%. So that impacts, taxpayers at that higher 37% bracket. There's a new 1% remittance tax on non-commercial payments, basically cash or similar transactions, individuals sending money abroad. That was dramatically scaled back. And so I think, you kind of see this dynamic of a lot of tax relief. There are tax increases, but they are much more targeted than I think folks were worried about. So turning to the next slide, which I think is interesting, is to talk about, okay, well, what's not in the bill? On the tax relief side, I think people were hoping for more kind of rollback of some of the tax increases that were enacted during the Biden administration. So I think folks were kind of hoping for the repeal of CANT, repeal of stock buyback excise tax. That didn't happen. They were never really considered very expensive. And again, on revenue offsets, I think the concern was for all the tax relief that there may be these broad kind of rate increase type proposals. Trump himself had suggested a so-called millionaires tax, bringing back the 39.6% top individual rate. That didn't happen. He had mentioned also changing taxation of carried interest. There was a lot of discussion kind of tied to an increase in the individual SALT deduction cap, whether businesses should be limited in their ability to deduct state taxes. That actually, there were variations of that included in both the House and Senate bill that dropped out. There were some people who thought not only was there not only going to be repeal of the stock buyback excise tax, but maybe there would be an increase. That didn't happen. some concern about an expansion of the number of employees subject to the 162M limitation. That didn't happen. Um, and then I think on the next slide, talking about, well, okay, what are things that um, were considered but kind of dropped during consideration of the bill as the bill was refined. And they were kind of searching for votes and seeing how popular things were. There was this big kind of international retaliation provision that was dropped. Again, there was some talk of salt limitations to pass throughs. That didn't happen. The House bill was much more draconian on the treatment of tax exempts. And so they had proposed an increase in the excise tax on private foundations. That didn't happen. There was an increase in for investment income of university endowments, that top 8%. The House had actually proposed a top rate of 21%. There were some other House provisions that didn't get in, the 50% limitation on the amortization of the purchase of sports franchise, making the Section 461L EBL rules more onerous. And then a Senate provision that was dropped was an excise tax on third-party litigation finance. So turning to the next slide. So we now have, and again, it's a very large bill. I tried to hit some of the highlights, but there are a lot of other kind of individual provisions to talk about. But talk a little bit about kind of what's next. There was limited legislative history for this bill. There was a markup at Ways and Means, so there's a House Committee on Ways and Means report, but there's no Senate Finance Committee report. There's no conference report, and a lot of the bill changed over time. So we will eventually get at some point. The Joint Committee will do a blue book, which will be interesting. There's a large potential that because the bill was kind of rushed, particularly at the end, there were a lot of changes at the end. There will need to be kind of cleanup legislation, so-called technical corrections. There obviously, this kicks off a massive guidance process at the IRS. I assume we'll start seeing some notices and some other kind of sub-regulatory guidance, and then we'll go through kind of the formal rulemaking process of proposed regulations, hearings, final regulations. I expect the priority will be on those Trump campaign proposals. So I think we'll see a slew of guidance on no tax on tips and no tax on overtime. I think it also means that pending guidance that a lot of us have been waiting for, let's say on the corporate alternative minimum tax, probably gets pushed off as the real priority and focus of the Treasury Department is on getting guidance out on this new bill. And then the other interesting dynamic we're seeing is that in order for Trump to gain the support of some of the fiscal hawks in the House for the final vote, he promised to be very aggressive in enforcement of provisions, particularly the IRA green energy credits. And so we've already seen one executive order. We expect more other administration action to really kind of, strictly enforce these provisions. And my assumption is try to do things and limit the availability of these credits more than they could actually do through the legislative process. We'll see how legal that is and how aggressive that is, but it is a new kind of interesting dynamic. Turning to the next slide. Obviously this was an exhausting, very bitter, very partisan, time-consuming process, and the Congress does have other priorities that we'll talk about, but there already is discussion of, can there be more tax legislation this year or next year before the midterm elections? We've already seen congressional leadership talk about the potential of doing 2 more reconciliation Republican-only partisan bills. They have one available for fiscal year 2026 and fiscal year 2027. There's talk of trying to do one in the fall and then doing one next year. I think unlikely, but the potential is out there. There also is the notion of maybe the Congress will do, kind of a traditional year-end bipartisan bill. There is some unfinished business. There are some provisions that expire at the end of the year, not related to TCJA, that weren't extended in this bill, including things like the work opportunity tax credit. There's always bipartisan cooperation on retirement incentives. So maybe once everyone gets done being really mad at one another and goes home for the August congressional recess, maybe they come back and decide to work together. And I do think, particularly once the calendar year turns, very difficult next year, even if it's reconciliation, to do something in an election year, but we'll have to see. Turning to the next slide. Besides tax, just other things the Congress is going to work on. They're currently working on this rescission legislation to take away previously appropriated funds. Their ability to do that expires on July 18th. Trump is putting a lot of pressure on congressional Republicans. There's some very controversial cuts in this bill to things like NPR, PBS. So we'll have to see, how far Trump's influence goes on a second bill so close after the reconciliation bill. Government funding runs out September 30th, and so they're either going to have to agree on government funding for the year or do a temporary funding, what's known as a continuing resolution or CR. There's an annual, what's called the NDAA, which is a defense policy bill that has to get done. And again, they may focus on some natural disaster relief as well. Turning to the next slide. And I think, Philip, maybe what we'll do is I'll run through the next 2 slides of dates, and then we can take a pause, see if there are any questions related to the bill, and then kind of go back to talking about the 2026 elections, if that works for you.
It works.
Okay. So just to lay out the rest of this year, again, July 18th, Congress has to act on this rescission legislation, or the administration is forced to spend those funds. Congress will be on a month-long recess for August. They'll come back early in September. I mentioned that there were 3 Democratic House members who unfortunately died over since the beginning of the year. There are special elections throughout the fall to fill those seats. There are 2 in September and 1 in November. Again, those are to replace Democratic members. Those seats are likely to remain Democratic. September 30th is that big deadline to fund the government, maybe through a CR, or there'll be a government shutdown. And then December 31st is the end of the year, and we do have some extenders like the work opportunity tax credit that will expire if not acted upon. And then last slide before we break for questions, turning to the next slide, just talking a little bit about 2026 and beyond. We head into the year, September 30th, they'll need, if there's a fiscal year 2026 bill, they'll need to have completed by then. We have the midterm congressional elections in 2026. And then kind of looking forward, obviously 2028 will be the presidential election. And then shortly thereafter, those Trump campaign tax proposals expire. And then at the end of 29, the increased individual SALT deduction cap of 40,000 reverts back to 10,000. So with that, Phil, should we take some questions?
So far, I cannot see any questions, but
Okay.
I would encourage our
Okay.
audience to ask them.
Okay. So why don't we turn then to the next slide? And I thought it would be interesting just to talk a little bit about the midterm congressional elections in 2026, because we do have these narrow majorities in the House and Senate. And so there is control of both bodies is up. There isn't a presidential election, obviously, but Democrats, if they're able to take, either the House or Senate or both, will be in a period of divided government. Reconciliation will fall off the table, and so any legislation would have to be on a bipartisan basis. So first, looking at the House, Republicans currently have that 5-seat majority, 220 to 215. So that means Democrats only need a net pickup of 3 seats to get to 218 to take control. And I think kind of trends and kind of history around Democrats' side that they would be able to take control back of the House. And that really is kind of a history lesson in that the president's party has lost House seats in 18 of the last 20 midterm elections since World War II. And the average loss is quite high. It's 25 seats. The 2 years where the president's party kind of didn't lose seats were kind of unique situations. One was 1998. It was right after the impeachment of President Clinton. The other was 2002, which was relatively close to after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And so kind of history and trends are on Democrat side. Um, and a lot of, particularly in the House in a midterm election, a lot of it really is dependent on where the country is at the time, particularly like where is inflation, where is the economy, what are gas prices looking at, like what's the overall mood of the country. A lot, I think, will be dependent on how this, one big beautiful bill is received, and what its impact is on the economy. Are people benefiting from no tax on tips and no tax on overtime? There is a delay in a lot of the spending cuts on Medicaid and food stamps. So, kind of an interesting dynamic to see what the impact will be on kind of the overall mood of the country and political polling. Um, I My own view is that I think it is well within possible, given that the Democrats only have to pick up 3 seats, that they take control. I don't think we're going to see a big Republican loss. And a lot of that is just kind of, the electorate is very polarized. And if we look at, obviously in the House, all 435 members are up for reelection. But only 3 Republicans are in congressional districts that were won by Vice President Harris. And by contrast, there are 13 Democrats that represent congressional districts that were won by President Trump. Kind of drilling down on some other interesting facts in the House election, turning to the next slide. 435 seats up for reelection. Right now, kind of the early polling suggests there are about 40 House seats that will be competitive, evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And so Democrats are not only going to have, need that net gain of 3 seats, which also means protecting some competitive seats. And I think for Democrats, the bad news is that they have had a number of Democrats announce that they're running for other office. They're running for Senate, they're running for governor. And so what was a relatively safe House Democratic seat is kind of more up in the air now. We haven't seen that dynamic play out yet on the Republican side. And the question there will be between now and kind of the primary season, are we going to see House Republicans retire? Because they're in battleground states, because they think they're going to, that control is going to go to Democrats. In the House, it's no fun being in the minority. So I think, again, in the House, which is probably the best chance for a Democratic pickup, it's going to be tight, but the numbers suggest that it's within striking range. But again, a lot depends on kind of the economy, where the country is, how the messaging and impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill works, but should be very interesting in the House. Turning to the Senate, the Senate, I think, is a different story. And I think the Senate, even though the numbers favor Democrats, I think Republicans are more likely to keep control of the Senate. Right now, Republicans have that 53 to 47 seat majority. So the Democrats would need a net pickup of 4 seats, which is what Republicans picked up in the last election. Democrats would need a net pickup of 4 seats to take control. Interesting fact, the Democrats have not swung more than, picked up a net of more than 3 seats in any election since 2008. And so they'd have to outperform what they've done kind of most recently. Roughly unlike the House, where every House member is up for election every 2 years, in the Senate, roughly 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years. In the last election, there were vastly more Democrats up than Republicans. That flips in this election, because the number of the number of Republicans up for reelection greatly is in excess of Democrats up. So on a numbers basis, the midterm elections are very favorable to Democrats because of the number of seats up for reelection. That being said, I think Republicans are heavily favored to retain the Senate because of those Republicans up. So there are 20 Republicans and 13 Democrats that are kind of on the regular schedule for reelection. Of those 20 So 33 seats. Of those 33 seats, 21 seats are in states that were won by Trump, and only 12 seats are in states won by Harris. There were also two special elections to fill Republican seats. One is the seat of a former seat of Vice President Vance in Ohio. The other is for Senator Rubio, who became Secretary of State in Florida. Those are likely to remain Republican seats. Turning to the next slide. Some kind of interesting facts with respect to looking at the Senate. There are some Democrats up for re-election in states won by Trump. There is only one Republican up for re-election in a state won by Harris. There are a number of Republicans who are potentially subject to primary, challenges in their own party in the primary. Senator Cornyn of Texas, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, Senator Collins of Maine, Senator Rounds of South Dakota, Senator Ernst of Iowa, who also may retire. And the thought being here is that these are relatively generally safe Republican seats with the kind of sitting senator if they were to choose to run again. The issue being is that if they lose to what would be generally a much further right primary challenger, those primary challengers have a good chance of beating the incumbent. So there's one in Texas that has a really good chance of beating Senator Cornyn. The problem is that then there's a much more likely chance that a Democratic candidate would beat them in the general election. And so there's a lot of kind of intra-party things going in with the Republican Party, because you do have these far-right potential primary challengers that would take out sitting senators who are much better candidates actually to get reelected. And so if you see a string of potential, you see a string of Republicans lose in primary Senate races, that opens up a lot of potential for Democrats. There have been a number of retirements, both on the Republican and on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, Senator McConnell is the former majority leader. Senator Tuberville, who's running for governor. Senator Tillis from North Carolina, who recently announced his retirement. He kind of went toe-to-toe with President Trump on the Medicaid cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. He threatened to vote against the bill, which he ultimately did, and that caused the need for Vice President Vance to cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. But Trump said that he then was going to support a primary challenger for Senator Tillis, so Senator Tillis then retired. There are a number of Democrats retiring, and whereas the retirements in the Republican states are generally safe Republican seats, maybe with the exception of Senator Tillis, a number of the Democratic retirements are in very competitive states. So Senator Peters in Michigan, Tina Smith in Minnesota, Senator Shaheen in New Hampshire. Those are seats that could go Republican. So those Democratic retirements in these competitive states are creating some potential opportunities for Republicans. Next slide. As I mentioned, there are a number of senators that are running for governor. Senator Bennett of Colorado, although he's not up for re-election. Senator Tuberville, I mentioned. And then Senator Blackburn, the Republican from Tennessee, is likely to announce a run. And so when we kind of take all of this in, Democrats need 4 seats. Right now, it looks like there are more Democratic seats in play than Republican seats. And so if we look at it again, a lot of this is based on retirements. There are probably 5 seats that are in play that are Democratic seats. Most of those are retirements. The other one is probably Senator Ossoff, who's the junior senator from Georgia. Georgia's always kind of a purple state. The elections are always very close. There are a couple of Republican seats in play. I mentioned Senator Tillis, and then Senator Collins in Maine, who also voted against the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so I think, whereas, obviously the margins are close in both the House and Senate, the House is probably the best opportunity for Democrats, which would lead to divided government. If that doesn't happen, The Senate is much more challenging, even though there are a lot more Republicans up than Democrats. I think the Senate's likely to stay Republican. And so, really, the thing to watch is going to be the House to see if we're going to have divided government or if we're going to have 2 more years of complete Republican control and kind of more partisan reconciliation bills. And with that, I'm Philip. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, at that point, I still don't see many questions. So, dear audience, gets that out. But I want to talk with you. Where do you see some unexpected changes? I mean, we have seen, for example, I mean, the bill is ordered in different chapters. The first one is basically making the TCJA permanent, but even there, when I read through the bill, I found a few provisions where I did see, I mean, yeah, you increased some amounts to made them, updated them for the current administration years. But if we, for example, go to the child tax credit increase, there is a little pitfall there. And that's that you are now required to include the social security number. And what I was surprised is that that provision, for example, has a um, particular definition of social security number, which basically says a social security number is um, either one of a US citizen or someone who is here permanently and authorized to work, but nothing else qualifies as a social security number. So someone who is not authorized to work, undocumented immigrants, or even children of US American born abroad but don't have a social security number by time the tax return is filed, they're all not eligible for the child tax credit under the bill. So that was one provision that surprised me. Do you have others when you read through it where you say that's a pitfall for the unwary?
Yeah, so I think, a lot. First of all, I think the requirement for social security numbers is something that you're going to find in a lot of provisions in the bill. It kind of goes with the kind of immigration enforcement kind of theme that runs through a lot of provisions. There's a lot of requirement, like kind of citizenship requirements, dealing with the Medicaid provisions and SNAP provisions. Um, and I agree those are kind of traps for the unwary and the potential for a lot of footfalls. I think we are dealing with a very large bill that, even though you know there are different timelines you can look at of like when it was considered, there were a lot of changes made at the end. There wasn't a Senate Finance Committee markup. We don't have a lot of legislative history, and so I do think we are going to be discovering things very much as we go along. I think over the last week, and particularly the bill was enacted kind of leading into the July 4th, holiday. But we are having we're getting a lot of client calls, and I anticipate we'll continue to get them of people who are reading the bill. They're starting to model it for, their own companies or their clients. And there are things that are popping out with questions, or I didn't realize this was in it. I think we're getting a lot of questions about these charitable contribution floors. I think that caught a lot of people by surprise. I think we are going to have a vibrant guidance process, and we will have technical corrections. We will have a joint committee explanation at some point. But for a lot of provisions, we're operating with just the legislative language, and a lot of it was done very late and very rushed. I mean, the international section of the bill, again, was only in the Senate, and it's only been on paper for about a week. And those provisions are complicated; they interact with one another, and so I think we are going to continue to get, hopefully not too many, but kind of unpleasant surprises about how the bill really works, and was it intended to work this way? Particularly, I think with interaction with other provisions, for example.
And we will see how Treasury manage all these upcoming guidance projects with a limited amount of.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good point. I mean, Treasury and the IRS have been, like most agencies and cabinet departments, been impacted by Doge and by retirements and freezing, hiring freezes and spending cuts. Um, Ken Keyes was finally confirmed as Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. Again, I think guidance on this new bill is going to be the priority. So hopefully we'll start seeing some things come out. But you are dealing with an IRS and Treasury that already has an overwhelming workload, has a reduced staff, reduced funding, and now has guidance on this massive piece of bill, massive piece of legislation to start working.
And we have a policy question from David, who basically asked if lobbyists and would be outlawed political
Right.
contributions, and we would replace them with town halls that are televised and other more transparent ways to influence the politics. Would it be less corrupt and transparent system? I mean, I'm not sure if I would necessarily use corrupt here, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we're coming off reconciliation bills, particularly this one. I mean, a lot of this was kind of done behind closed doors. And we saw things very late that then immediately went to the Senate floor and were acted upon. There were less hearings, there were less, kind of less working groups, less ability to comment. And I think that in many ways will lead to a product where you will have unintended consequences and the need to fix it through subsequent legislation and guidance. And so I do think and it really is, a lot of it is the byproduct of a reconciliation, partisan, one party only bill. But to be honest, that's, Democrats have done that when they've had, full control of Congress and the White House. That's how the, Obama healthcare legislation was enacted. That's how a lot of major pieces of tax and other legislation have enacted when we've had Republican control and Democratic control. I think it's unfortunate because most significant tax legislation now is not bipartisan and it is reconciliation where there is less of a kind of open process, if you will. I am going to
Another
defer on the carbon credit question and get back to Robert on that one if he could email me because I just have to take a look. And then there's a question on the for the taxable floor on charitable contributions. Once a donor hits that floor, that's correct. You can only deduct the amount in excess of the floor. So individuals lose that first 0.5% of taxable income amount, and then corporations lose 1%. That floor that's correct. The floor applies to donations made in 2026 and onward. It is permanent, but that does provide this window before the end of the year if people are interested in kind of accelerating or rethinking their contribution strategy. As far as the overall economic effect of the bill, there are estimates out there. One is that it will increase the deficit by $3.8 trillion. I think Republicans are of the view. First of all, I think Republicans were under pressure from Trump to get this bill done, and I think also under the belief that the tariff policy of the administration, which has caused kind of uncertainty and problems in the economy, that this bill is the solution to that. I personally don't believe that. A lot of the so-called tax relief in this bill is not new tax relief. It's extending current law, which I don't think has a particularly kind of economic growth effect. And then kind of the new tax relief in this bill is very targeted, kind of no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. They benefit very kind of small portions of the economy. The Medicaid and SNAP cuts in this bill are really dramatic, and will kind of going to the question, will impact the poorest of Americans. With respect to obviously, kind of with Medicaid, with food stamps, school lunch programs are going to be decimated by this bill. And so it is, I think Republicans, the line for Republicans is that this bill is going to bring about this great economic growth that the Joint Committee on Taxation and CBO and other scorekeepers aren't measuring correctly. But if you go by the numbers, this will have just an unbelievable impact on the deficit and then specifically on lower income Americans.
And you touched on 2 points. One is the no tax on tips. Be very careful with that provision. When I read it, there were many pitfalls in there. For example, you have to file a joint return if you want to claim that. I mean, the benefit is even if you are not itemizing your deduction, it seems that you can claim these credits. So that's was it
Yeah, I think one of the
like car loans, for example, deducting, but that's only good for US cars again. So you have to read these provisions very, very carefully um, to avoid any pitfalls there.
yeah, I think the other thing for employers um, who have tipped employees who pay overtime, obviously there's going to need to be a lot of kind of compliance and see what the IRS does from an enforcement perspective. But I also think there's like a serious kind of employee relations and messaging issue here, because again, these are income tax exclusions, and so for employees, particularly lower income employees who hear no tax on tips or no tax on overtime, they think it's all tax, but it's only income tax. And a lot of these folks don't pay income tax, but they're still going to be subject to employment taxes. And I do think that kind of messaging, it's putting employers, I think, in a bit of a tough spot, because their employees are hearing no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, but these are still subject to employment taxes, for example. And so that's a messaging exercise.
And they have to comply with a lot of information reporting,
Right.
employers. So they have a lot of new paperwork coming towards them.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and Robert, Tweeps, for your question about the status of carbon credits, these energy laws were something I had a great interest in, and also our firm is currently writing a provision by provision overview, which we will publish shortly. So if you're signing up for our blog, you will be informed. But basically, um, they're still there. That's the good news. You have some, especially foreign influence entities, that are now disqualified from getting them. There is a new structure intended to streamline and equalize the credit amounts across different types. But if you're looking in particular in section 70, 522, and 524, you will find the restrictions on carbon oxide credits. The sequestration credits are in 2020, in 522. So
Thank you for that.
um, let's see. We have other questions. I don't see them. What is your opinion of the new Trump accounts?
Right. Yeah, the new Trump accounts are interesting. I think it's a limited kind of population of kind of children in a certain time period who are eligible for them. The fact that there is this pilot program where the government kicks in $1,000, I think will be very attractive. Um, I think they were originally called MAGA accounts. But I think I think it'll just be interesting to see kind of what the uptake is.
And all of these, or not all of these, the TCJA provision for businesses are made permanent, but like Trump accounts, tax on overtime, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, car loans, these are sunsetting after the current administration leaves office. So that's another thing that where they have kicked the can down the road,
Yeah,
and
yeah. And I don't
truly,
think, again, these are expensive provisions, but also I don't think uh, it's unique when you have kind of new innovative tax relief provisions that they are first enacted on a temporary basis. Let's see what the uptake is. Do they do what the Congress intended? Um, how does Treasury feel about enforcing them, and the IRS? So I think yet to be seen kind of what the success is. The question on the income limits on the new SALT increase, the phase out for that begins at 500,000. and then that it expires at some point and reverts, I think, in 2029 back to 10.
And one thing I want to make people aware of is we have to get used to new terminology in the international tax section. We are giving up the term guilty, for example, which is now be NCTI, I believe.
Yeah,
So
I
we have
think people. I think people are starting to use the necktie as the
it,
new acronym.
it's a new guilty.
Right.
So we have to get used to some new terms in the international tax
Yeah,
law.
and international, again, international with provisions. Those were just put the kind of House deferred to the Senate, so the House did not have an international package. Senate put in a significant one. It was modified over time, particularly with respect to the beat. There are some really interesting things in there. There's permanence of 954C6, the CFC look-through rule. The downward attribution issue that had been lingering since 2017 has been fixed. But I think also no legislative history, complicated provisions that interact with one another. A lot of our clients are modeling the impact, and I think will require kind of significant revision of existing regs.
Do you have an opinion how they have not really restructured it, but the bonus depreciation, they made it permanent and they have restructured it slightly, but we have to get to a few new requirements there.
Yeah, I mean, I think on bonus, to me, the most interesting thing on bonus is, first of all, it had expired. It's been kind of trending down. It goes back to 100%, but the effective date is January 20th, which is very odd, but that's the inauguration day. And so we do have, honestly, we have clients now who are looking to see kind of what they did in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the year, which is interesting. There's an expansion of bonus for kind of new factories and related buildings. So those to me are the kind of more significant changes.
And we have a question regarding upcoming tax legislation in the next 3 years. So,
yeah.
for
So
instance,
again, I think as far as potential, there are 2 more reconciliation bills available before the midterm elections. There's also some some interest in a bipartisan bill. It's really hard to tell. I think that this was a very bruising political exercise on this reconciliation bill, and so whether there's an energy for, even if it's a Republican-only reconciliation bill or a bipartisan bill in the fall, where they do have other items like funding the government, I just don't know if it comes together. And then I would think next year would be relatively quiet because of the midterm elections. It's always hard to get significant legislation, particularly tax legislation, through in an election year. With respect to your question on 899, I do think that the kind of the introduction of it had the intended effect, but it remains out there to see how different countries kind of implement this agreement. And I think it will linger out there, and maybe it will come back in revised form. I think that's very realistic. On the question on the SALT phase out, I don't know, Philip, if you know that. I don't know how it interacts with California state law.
I hope I do not promise wrong things, but we have together with the LA County Bar, we are planning some in-depth discussion about some of these, and one will be the conformity to California. So we will have a program hopefully soon, particular on that. I cannot answer that from the tip of my head.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think a lot of people are wondering.
There's a lot of conformity issues with that bill in California, but sure. I think we have that every time we see a new federal tax bill.
Right.
Since we have no further questions, but a little bit of time still, that we have a few credits, especially childcare, adoption, dependent care credits for our CPAs to look into higher education, student loan relief. They have to get familiar with. There are some expanded 529 plan flexibility for K-12 and workforce credential, some tiered excise. I think you mentioned that's the excise tax reform for wealthy private universities. So there is a lot, especially in the end of the bill, a lot of, at least from the tax section, a lot of smaller provisions that are really worth reading. The opportunity zones will be a separate issue probably. But yeah, with that, let me see if we have any new questions. There's one coming in. And non-partisan.
I hope.
And from my perspective, one focus of my practice is crypto, and I was missing crypto in that bill. Mm-hmm. But we have a new tax bill from Senator Loomis, which is basically reintroduction of the Loomis-Gillibrand bill from the last 2 years. So we will see if that will be more successful this time. But yeah, I would give you the opportunity to say some last comments.
Yeah, I just want to thank you and the Bar Association. Is a great opportunity. And my contact information is on the end of the presentation if folks have questions. I think we're all learning about this bill on kind of a dynamic basis, but if folks have questions, feel free to reach out to me.
And also look on their websites. They have interesting podcasts there. Yeah, thank you for putting that together in that short amount of time. I mean, we just saw the bill last week, so thank you so much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.